It is my incredible pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Professor Jonathan Losos, who is joining us, as Padma said, from the United States and from Missouri. Well, actually, I guess I'm not sure exactly where you're, but I assume Missouri, from St. Louis. And this is a real treat because, in my opinion, and I think many people's opinions, Jonathan is, one of the world-leading evolutionary biologists, and the work that he does is incredibly integrative and really answers some of the fundamental questions about evolution using island systems and lizard evolution in particular, but also looking at other systems, in particular looking at urban evolution in recent years. Now, Jonathan studied was born and raised in around St. Louis, Missouri, and studied biology at Harvard University, where he did his bachelor's degree. And then he went on to get his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. So obviously some very highly esteemed institutions there, which have amazing track records of training top evolutionary biologists. So already tells you that Jonathan has an incredibly broad knowledge and broad background. After he finished, he actually returned to Washington University in St. Louis, where he spent several years being promoted through the ranks up to professor, and then actually moved back to Harvard University in the mid-2000s, where he spent several years as the curator of herpetology in the Museum of Comparative Zoology, as well as being the Monique and Philip Lenner Professor for the Study of Latin America and a professor in the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology. Now, refuting the suggestion that you can't go home again, Jonathan did return to Washington University in 2018, where he is the William Danforth Distinguished University Professor in the Department of Biology, and as well as the founding director of the Living Earth Collaborative, which is a biodiversity partnership between Washington University, the Missouri Botanical Garden, and the St. Louis Zoo. And this is, you can maybe expand on this, but this is an initiative really to support the study of biodiversity, which is obviously very close to the heart of what the Linnean Society is also very interested in. So it's really fantastic to see the great work that is being done in that institution, and of course by biologists like Jonathan. So if there is a major award in evolutionary biology, Jonathan has won it, including the E.O. Wilson Naturalist Award and the Sewell Wright Award. He's also a fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, as well as many other distinguished honors. So I can rattle on forever, I think, with the list of the amazing work that Jonathan has done, but I think we'd all prefer to hear it from him himself. So let me hand over to Jonathan, who is going to be presenting to us on lizard evolution in real-time field experiments on evolutionary process.
Well, thank you, Anjali, for those very kind words, and thanks to the Linnean Society for the invitation, and for all of you for listening to me today. My talk today is going to summarize a research program that has gone on through my entire career, and I hope that you will indulge the somewhat autobiographical nature of the talk. I hope it's of some use to perhaps younger viewers to see how a career can change, a research program can move in unexpected directions due to contingent events and so on. So with that, as a prelude, let's go. Let's see if I can. So this is me in my younger days. What a handsome fellow I was. I was a college student and a graduate student in these pictures. And one of the first things that I remember, and the most important event, was a talk that I went to hear in my third year in university as a junior. And it was by John Endler, the famous evolutionary biologist, on this now classic study he did on guppies. But this is when the study actually came out. And what Endler started with was the observation that guppies that live on the island of Trinidad vary in their appearance, the males in particular, that high up on mountain streams, they're quite colorful, whereas down below, they're quite drab. And so the question is, what caused this variation in color? And it turns out that there was an association that lower down this larger predatory fish, the pike cichlid, occurred, and higher up it did not occur. And so the hypothesis was that that sexual selection favors larger males, more colorful males. Females like that for some reason. And so higher up where there's no predators, the males become very colorful, but lower down, that color attracts the predators and they all get eaten. And so that was a plausible explanation. But as we all know, correlation does not prove causation. And the gold standard of science in general is to do an experiment. But back in those days, that was sort of out of the question, but not to Endler. And so that's what he did. He did an experiment. He moved fish from the bland fish from lower down where the predator occurred, and he just put a population higher up without the predators. And sure enough, within a few years, they had evolved to become much more colorful. And then he repeated that experiment in greenhouses in the lab, very naturalistic surroundings, and got the same result. Well, this back in the this is a classic study, and back in the 1980s, early 80s, it was just astonishing. I remember walking out and listening to the graduate students say how amazed they were. Evolutionary ecology is a true science, or something like that. But anyway, it made a huge impact. It was very important in demonstrating that evolution can occur rapidly when conditions change, when natural selection is strong, something we now take for granted, but that was not clear back then. It also made it clear that evolutionary biologists can conduct experiments actually in nature. All right, fast forward now to graduate school. And I was doing my research on anolis lizards, which I'll get to in a moment. And I read this paper by Tom Shaner and his then wife, Amy Shaner. And what they had done is they had noticed in surveys in the Bahamas that small islands do not have, naturally have anolis lizards on them. All but the small islands do. And so they decided to do an experiment to put these lizards on islands too small for them naturally to occur, to watch them go extinct and to learn something about the process of extinction, something that even today we need to know more about. Well, and here's the workhorse of this entire talk, the brown anole, Anolis sagrii. And so what they did is they put a population of lizards, 5 or 10 lizards, on islands of different size. All of these islands were smaller than the threshold where they occur naturally. Well, to their surprise, on most of the islands, the lizards survived for the extent of the experiment, which when they published it was 5 years. It was only on the very tiniest islands that the populations did not survive. And this is, look, very tiny, we're talking 10 square meters. So how can we account for the fact that you don't see lizard populations there, but if you put them there, they do just fine? Well, we'll get to an answer to that later on. But what they had done is they had created these experimental populations. Now, I was doing my PhD thesis looking at the evolution of limb length in anolis lizards in a phylogenetic comparative context. And basically, what this analysis showed was that there was a repeated pattern that species that occupied broad surfaces, such as tree trunks, had very long hind limbs, whereas species that use narrow surfaces, such as twigs, have short legs. And these patterns had evolved multiple times across the phylogeny. Moreover, functional stories showed that there was an advantage to the leg length, that on broad surfaces, long-legged lizards run faster. But on narrow surfaces, short-legged lizards are more agile. They don't fall off. So this association between limb length and functional capability and where you found them was a strong suggestion that lizards were evolving their limbs to adapt to the habitats they were using, the structural habitats. But again, this is just a correlation. And I remembered Endler's research and thought, well, I remembered the importance of doing experiments. And it occurred to me that the Shaners had essentially done that experiment. They had created experimental islands, and we could test whether the species had adapted to them. And I contacted Tom Shaner and said, has it occurred to you that you've done an evolution experiment? And his response was only what I could have hoped for in my wildest dreams. And that was simply, what a great idea. Why don't you come do a postdoc and look into it? And so that's what I did. And that was the start of this research program that has continued over 3 decades. And so the talk today will be, I can't see the whole screen because things are there, but experiments on evolution in the Bahamas, a play in 4 acts. Here they are. If I have time, you can see I'm talking a little fast. I'm going to tell you some of the more recent findings. And here is the cast of characters, the collaborators on this project. Tom Shaner, of course, the esteemed ecologist at the University of California, Davis, his longtime research associate, Dave Spiller, In some of the more recent work, we've been joined by two former graduate students of mine, Manuel Leal, now at the University of Missouri in Columbia, and Jason Colby at the University of Rhode Island. And this has really been truly a collaborative effort among the four of us and others at various times. So let's start with Act One. Act One, adaptation to different environments. So this is the Shaner's study. It occurred on small islands in the middle of the Exuma Keys in the Bahamas. And here, just to show you what these islands look like, here's a view from an airplane. And here's a map. We're talking about these islands here. So you can see the bar, that's a kilometer. So these are small islands, tiny islands. This is one of our islands here. So they're very small islands. I should point out that we introduced the lizards from the island in the background. We are bringing in species that occur naturally throughout the Bahamas. And as I'll talk about later, we've seen populations both go extinct on these islands and recolonize them. So we're emulating a natural process. So I assumed that these islands would vary in vegetational characteristics when I read the Shaner's paper, and that was correct. So some are more thickly vegetated, even with trees. Others are just covered with narrow, scraggly vegetation. And so knowing what had happened over millions of years in anole evolution, the hypothesis was that limb length would differentiate based on the characteristics on the islands, as shown here. And so here I am, this is back probably sometime around 2000. What we would do is we'd go to the islands, we would capture the lizards, and I would measure their leg length right then and there with a ruler, an ocular micrometer, and so on. That rope there at the bottom is attached to the motorboat that we would go around to the different islands to visit. This chair came from the hotel we were staying in, which we borrowed without telling them. So here are the results. Now I should tell you, so these are the experimental islands that the Shaner's by this time had introduced 11 to 15 years previously. Each point is the mean value for a different island population of Anolis sagrii. The axes on this graph should have been reversed. On the y-axis is the mean perch diameter where we found the lizards, and the x-axis is their limb length. And what you see is a significant relationship. Lizards that use narrower surfaces had shorter limbs, whereas on islands where they're using broader surfaces, they had longer limbs. In other words, this suggested that over the course of 10 to 15 years, which is 20-ish generations, the populations had differentiated in exactly the predicted way, that they were adapting they're evolving and adapting exactly as predicted. Well, this was an exciting finding, and we got it accepted for publication in Nature. Now, I didn't know this at the time, but when every week Nature puts out a press release where they hype a couple of their papers and they send it out to the media in advance to generate interest. And they chose our paper to hype. And here's what they had to say. They sent this out in anticipation of, a week before the paper came out. This may be among the most important work in evolutionary studies since Darwin studied the diversity of finches on the Galapagos Islands during the voyage of the Beagle. Well, come on, it was a nice study, but this was ridiculous, over the top. But the world's media just ate it up. And at that time, it turns out we were back in the Bahamas doing more field work. And all of a sudden, the phone was ringing off the line in the manager's office, because we didn't have a phone in our room. New York Times, Boston Globe, USA Today, ABC News wanted to fly a crew out to visit us. It was crazy, but we got great publicity. And I have to say that my career certainly benefited from all this publicity we got in the media due to this crazy press release. So that was one of the contingent events that who knows what role it played in where I am today. However, so I gave talks, seminars on this research, and there was one question that always came up, and it was usually those pesky botanists, and they would ask about phenotypic plasticity. We know, even back then, we knew that plants in particular exhibit a lot of plasticity. You water some more than others, they'll grow differently, you give them more light or whatever. So we knew that in plants, phenotypic plasticity could occur, and sometimes it could be seemingly beneficial to the organisms. And so the question was, could phenotypic plasticity explain our results? Could lizards that grew up using broader surfaces actually just grow longer legs? And in other words, are our results perhaps not genetically based? Well, this struck me as a ridiculous idea of lizards growing longer legs just because they're sitting on broader perches, but I kept on getting the question. So finally I needed to do something about it. So I went to the library to look on the literature on the effect of perch diameter on lizard limb growth. And Of course, there was no literature. No one had ever studied that question. But there was a related research area that was somewhat relevant. It was among the most odd studies I had ever seen. And basically, this research asked, what is the effect of exercise on a growing animal, not lizards, but other animals? So, for example, the researchers would take mice and they would put them into two groups, and they would take growing, young mice, and half of them would run on a wheel for hours every day, and the other half wouldn't be given a wheel. And so the question is, what effect would running have on the development of the limbs? Or another study put rats into a bathtub and made them tread water for about 4 hours every day. Again, the control group didn't have to do this. Or another study put chickens on a treadmill and made them run for hours every day for the same purpose. Now, I know what you're thinking. I do know that that is not a chicken, that is a mouse. I couldn't find any pictures of chickens on treadmills when I'm putting the talk together. However, I did give this talk a little while ago, and at the end of it, someone sent me this picture as perhaps a better illustration of what the study was doing. In any case, all of these studies looked at the effect of exercise, putting stress on limbs during growth of various organisms. What they found was that there is an effect, that individuals that exercise more develop thicker limbs, because it turns out, I didn't know this back then, that bone is a very dynamic substance. And if you put a lot of stress on bone, more calcium will be deposited to make that bone stronger. This is true in humans and weightlifters. Those who lift weights a lot have a lot thicker forearms. However, our result was not the thickness of a limb, but it was the length of a limb. And for the most part, there were almost no studies that showed an effect of exercise on limb length. But there was one notable exception. And this is a paper from the 1950s, and it was on human tennis players, male tennis players. And basically, if you think about professional tennis players, these are people that throughout their lives, during their formative growth years, were smacking balls for hours every day. And so the question was, did that affect how long their arms were? And of course, the great thing is that the tennis player's other arm could be the control. You compare the serving arm to the non-serving arm. And sure enough, what this work showed was that the tennis players, their serving arm was longer. And the measurements were based on X-rays, so it wasn't that the ligaments were looser or something. They were longer limbs. And so this did show that that exercise and stress during growth could affect limb length. Now, of course, it's a long ways from professional tennis players to lizards perching on different surfaces, but we realized we needed to do an experiment. And so we did. We set up an experiment conducted at the St. Louis Zoo, where we got baby brown anoles, and we put them in two treatments. One treatment allowed the lizards, as they were growing up, to use very broad surfaces, 2x4s. This is the natural situation for brown anoles. And this is a happy lizard. He's spread out. He likes to be sitting like that. Look at that happy expression. This is not a happy lizard. This was the other treatment, the narrow surfaces. They spent their entire growing period hunkered down, hanging on to these narrow surfaces. So we grew the lizards in these ways, and my phone is ringing. And the question is, did it affect limb length? So here's what we found. Well, first, we found a difference in, this is relative hind limb length. We've statistically removed the effect of body size. Males had relatively longer limbs than females. We knew that. It's a sexually dimorphic trait. But here's the important comparison between the broad treatment and the narrow treatment. And sure enough, to our surprise, lizards that grew up on broad surfaces developed longer legs. In fact, we were so surprised by this, but we did the experiment twice and got the same result both times. Since then, a number of other studies have looked at this phenomenon in anolis lizards and more or less found the same results with some variation. So there is a component of phenotypic plasticity in limb length that may be affected by what lizards are actually using when they're growing up. Of course, it would be great to study this in the field instead of an artificial lab experiment, but that's a lot harder to do and hasn't been done. However, then the question is, was there any genetic change at all? And I can only, for the moment, answer this indirectly. This is the amount of difference in limb length between the broad surface treatment and the narrow surface treatment. We compare that to variation in limb length in natural populations and in the populations the Shainers had studied in the field. And you see that the plasticity, even in this quite different surfaces, from basically a flat surface to a very thin, narrow one, could not explain most of the variation in the experimental introductions. So we infer that this must have been a genetic change for the most part, perhaps with a plastic component on top of that. Now, it's taken a long time, but we finally are closing in on being able to look at some of the genes underlying limb length. We're not there yet, but I think in the next couple of years we will be. So hopefully soon we'll be able to actually get at the genetic basis more directly. But I'm going to assume for the purposes now that these changes are actually genetically based. So that led then to the next part of the experiment, which looked at the effect of interspecific competition on limb evolution. One of the major areas of research in anoles for decades has been looking at competition or other interactions between species and how they affect habitat use. Our question was, does that in turn affect selection on limb length? To do that, we moved slightly to the southeast in the Bahamas to the island of Great Exuma. And there we added a second player in this story, and that is the green anole, Anolis smaragdinus, a close relative of the green anole in the United States, Anolis carolinensis. Now, smaragdinus is a more arboreal species. It's found higher up, tends to use narrower surfaces. It also is a lizard that has shorter legs, bigger toe pads, and other characteristics. And so again, we did experiments on small islands, smaller than they're normally found on naturally, but this time we had a couple of treatments. Well, the first thing we did is we found 15 small empty islands, and we grouped the islands into sets of 3 similar islands based on size and characteristic. Among those 3 islands, we randomly assigned 1 island to get brown anoles, 1 island to get green anoles, and 1 island to get both. And then we replicated those 3 treatments across the 15 islands. And so the question was, does the presence of the other species affect the population biology of the lizards, and then does that affect their limb length? So the first question is, can brown anoles survive on these small islands? We'd already seen it once in the Shaner's experiment, but the same question. What about green anoles? They're not found on these islands naturally. Can they survive? And then, is there evidence that the 2 species interact? So first, the brown anoles. 1 year after the introduction, we introduced 5 lizards, 2 males and 3 females. All the populations had at least doubled in size, and some had truly exploded in size. After 3 years, all the populations were very well established, except one that was oddly down to a single lizard, although that population rebounded later on as well. So yes, as in the first experiment, brown anoles can survive on these islands. What about green anoles? Here the results were different. 1 year into the study, 8 out of the 10 islands had at least doubled in size. 3 years later, 1 island had just exploded with green anoles everywhere, but most islands are doing badly. 4 had gone extinct, and another 2 only had males, and those only had 1 individual, and that individual was a male. So it seems that these islands, these small islands, are challenging to green anoles. We don't know exactly why. Our guess is that it's due that these are very arid islands due to the strong winds, but that has never been established. But what about the interaction? Is there an effect of one species on the other? Well, these are the population trends. We're looking at the green anoles here. The yellow line is when they're sympatric with the brown anoles. The red line is when they're by themselves. Remember, there were 5 blocks, and each block had an island green anoles alone, green anoles with brown anoles. What we see is that in the middle of the experiment, when times were good, the red line is always higher. So the green anoles, when they're by themselves, have higher population densities. So this argues that brown anoles actually have a negative effect on green anoles, at least when times are good. And so the species do interact with each other, and perhaps that is a driving force to differentiate their habitat use and perhaps selection on limb length. That does leave a question, though. Why don't we see the anoles on the smaller islands? We've shown that the brown anoles certainly can establish there, and at least some green anoles can. Well, the idea that the Shaners have put out in their first paper, the one that when you think there must be something that happens just episodically, periodically, that's really bad, that keeps them from getting established on those islands. And when you're in the Bahamas or the Caribbean, or that part of the world, something bad means hurricanes. And that's what the Shaners had suggested in their paper. Maybe the hurricanes explain their absence from the islands. Now, Shaner had been working in the Bahamas since about around 1970, the early 1970s, and he had, in this sense, the bad fortune of working there just when there had been a natural lull in hurricane frequencies. And so he had never actually seen a hurricane to be able to get data on this idea. However, as you probably know, that natural lull ended in the mid-90s, probably accentuated by climate change, and there's been a lot of hurricane activity ever since. In fact, this is Hurricane Lily churning its way over Cuba in 1996. Hurricane Lily was a Category 2 storm, and it was going across Cuba. And the interesting thing is that it was seemingly headed straight to our study islands in the Great Exuma. We had mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, perhaps finally we could test this idea that hurricanes are responsible for the distribution and the absence of lizards from small islands. So that was exciting. On the other hand, we were on the islands at the time, and so we were less excited about it. So here's what happened. As soon as the hurricane passed over Cuba, it took a hard turn to the right. And as you can see, it was going to miss our islands. But then it turned right back and it was headed straight towards us. And this is the mid-1990s, pre-internet times to some extent. So what we did was the bank in Georgetown where we were staying gave out little maps. And so everyone would tune in to the BBC, not your BBC, the Bahamas Broadcast Corporation. And every 3 hours, they would give us an update, the coordinates, and you would plot where the storm was. And sure enough, it was headed straight towards us. In fact, it scored a direct hit. The eye of the hurricane went directly over us in Georgetown. Now, the effects were dramatic. Many trees were uprooted or snapped in half. We counted 17 yachts that had been sunk or beached, and it was clearly a major happening. I didn't mention, just by incredible good fortune, we had just finished our surveys for the year when the hurricane hit. So we had the very unusual opportunity to go back to islands that had been censused a week previous to see what had happened. And so we helped clean up the next day, and the day after that, we took our boat out of the tree that it ended up in, which somehow I failed to get a picture of. We didn't have iPhones back then, and went back out. And so one last thing, I didn't point out, here's where we're based in Georgetown. Our islands were on both sides of Great Exuma, some of them on the southwest here, some on the northeast. And so we went first to the northeastern islands on the other side of Great Exuma from where the storm was coming from. Now, hurricanes, when they go over land, do slow down. However, Great Exuma is only 1 mile wide, and that's not enough land to slow a hurricane down significantly. So there was no difference in wind speed. So we went to the far side islands first. And what we found, we recensused the lizard populations, and they clearly had been affected. They were down by 1/3 or 40%. And when we looked at the vegetation, you could see something had happened. Leaves were blown off trees, branches were snapped. Clearly, the hurricane had had an effect, but clearly it was in some sense a quantitative, non-catastrophic effect. We then went to the islands on the near side. And this is my favorite island in the study, a lushly vegetated island. This is the one island that the green and old population had exploded. And so you would walk through this hip-high vegetation and the lizards would just be jumping out of your way like grasshoppers. It was delightful. Well, this is the island when we went to revisit it. In fact, we didn't recognize it when we went by it at first. We thought it was in the wrong place. All of the vegetation has been stripped away, except the rachicalus that lives in the ground among the sinkholes. Basically, all the bushes were gone. And this was repeated on every island on this side. This had been a 10-foot high tree with a big 10-foot wide canopy. The canopy is spreading out. The tree behind it as well. Those trees were destroyed. All the vegetation is gone. Same thing here. A big, enormous bush covering much of the island. All washed away. These islands were as if a bomb had hit. It was just stunning, the change. So we went out to survey the lizard populations, and that turned out to be easy. There were no lizards at all. And so what we had seen was that, in fact, hurricanes can remove lizards from these small islands. And so the reason these islands are empty is that although lizards can colonize islands, they don't do it rapidly. And so depending on how often the hurricanes come along, small islands tend not to be covered. I'm sorry, to have lizards on them. But then the last question, why did we only see this on the exposed islands on the near side and not on the far side? As I told you, it's not difference in wind speed. However, there was one clue to this, and this was on one of the southwest islands that got devastated. On the top of the island, we found this. Now, I don't know if there are any marine biologists, but for those of you who aren't in the audience, let me tell you this. Sea stars do not live on the top of islands. What this indicated was that these islands were underwater, and that in fact, there's what we all know here in the United States. Now, there are these storm surges and hurricanes, water elevated, as much as 5 meters, and it comes crashing into the islands at great force. Well, these islands, the maximum height is about 2 to 3 meters. So not only did these waves strip away a lot of the vegetation, but then they were underwater for, who knows, 6 to 12 hours. And some combination of that was sufficient to wipe out the lizards and the vegetation on these islands. But then the storm surge hits Great Exuma, which has a maximum elevation of 30 meters. That stops the storm surge. And then there's not enough open water on the other side for a storm surge to develop before it hits our other islands. And so that explains why some islands are affected and why also higher islands aren't affected, because they're not submerged, but they're not overrun by this tidal surge. Anyway, that was the effect of hurricanes. It ended that experiment. That was okay. I was kind of tired of it. We were getting an idea of what was happening ecologically. And that set the stage then for Act 3, the study of the effect of predation on lizard habitat use and evolution. Now, to do that, I need to introduce two things. First, we moved again up to the north to the island of Abaco. We were based in Marsh Harbor. And a new character in our study is this guy, the curly-tailed lizard. This is a lizard that is larger than brown anoles, substantially larger. It's also almost entirely terrestrial, particularly as an adult. And it occurs in the Bahamas, just like the brown anole, and occurs on some of the small islands we're on. And it was documented to have an important trait. And that trait is it eats brown anoles. This is a picture Tom Shaner took. But what we didn't know is how important of an ecological phenomenon is this? Does it eat them willy-nilly all the time and have a major impact? Or is it only once in a blue moon and has no greater significance? So we set up an experiment similar to the others where we put, let me start by saying, we started this time with somewhat larger islands that naturally had brown anoles. And so what we did was we introduced curly tail lizards to half of the islands, randomly selected, leaving the other as control. Well, the first thing we found was that there was an immediate effect. Here's the introduction, and the population on the control islands goes up. This is babies being born mostly, and then comes back down. But you can see a much more muted increase in the presence of the curly tails. The curly tails are eating the babies and maybe some of the larger lizards. And as you can see, there's about a 50% difference in population size. So clearly the curly tails are having a dramatic effect. In turn, the brown anoles are no dummies. In the presence of the curly tails, they shift up into the vegetation. They perch off the ground and much higher. Now, as you can see, this shift actually continued throughout the course of the experiment. I can't explain why it went like that, but we do see a shift in habitat use. Well, unfortunately, that experiment was terminated. This is Hurricane Floyd in 1999. Here's our study site right here. That experiment was terminated, although interestingly, I won't get into the details, but the eggs in the ground this time survived. It was a little earlier of a hurricane. And so the populations were able to replenish themselves through the egg bank, if you will, even though all the living lizards were washed away. And so we waited 4 or 5 years for the vegetation to recover, the anole population to recover, and we were able to do the experiment a second time. But this time we were able to build on the results. We now knew that there would be an effect, that predation is important. And so we did something different. I mean, again, we picked 12 islands and randomly assigned the curly tails to 6 of them. But this time, before putting the curly tails out there, we captured as many of the brown anoles as we could on each island, measured their limb length, and gave each lizard a unique marker equivalent to a bird band. We were injecting this non-toxic rubbery substance called an elastomer. And so you can see this lizard here has a lime green mark here in its upper forearm on the left, and a reddish orange one on the thigh on the right. So each lizard got a different combination. So what that meant is that we had for each lizard its limb length, and we could go back later and see if it survived or not. And then we introduced the curly tails, and we came back 6 months later. And so what you can see is first their use of the ground. This is a different way of portraying the same data, but what that shows is that the percentage of them on the ground is much lower in the presence of curly tails. So again, they're up in the bushes, as in the previous experiment, whereas in the control islands without the curly tails, many more of them are using the ground. So they're shifting up. And so we measured what is called a selection gradient, which is just a measure of how strong selection is operating on the lizards. If long-legged lizards survive better than short-legged lizards, then you would have a high selection gradient. If conversely, the short-legged lizards are surviving better, then you would have a negative selection gradient, large but negative. If there's no difference, then the selection gradient is 0. And just to recap, what we did is we went back to the islands and we recaught all the lizards, and then compared to the ones that we had started with, we could look at who survived and who didn't, and whether hind limb length was related to survival. So here's what we found. On the islands with the curly tail lizards, this is the mean selection gradient across islands, there was strong selection for longer hind limbs, whereas on the islands without the curly tails, without the predators, there was no selection going on. So what this would seem to indicate is that the curly tails were preferentially catching and eating these shorter legged lizards, which we know are slower on a broad surface. And so presumably they were easier to catch. And so the longer legged lizards were surviving better. So this was clearly the curly tails were having a strong impact on the selection on limb length. Well, we know from, this is a slide I showed previously, that in the presence of curly tails, they move higher up into the vegetation. And these vegetations are bushy, small trees, and so on. We also know that higher vegetation is narrower vegetation. And so in the presence of curly tails, they start using narrower vegetation. And so that is what happens over the course of the previous experiments. We also know over millions of years what happens when lizards start using narrower surfaces. They evolve shorter legs. So the point is that our expectation was that through time, selection would, once the anoles were up in the trees, selection would change and start favoring these shorter legged individuals. Well, to our surprise, this switch occurred much more rapidly than expected. And in the second 6-month sampling period, suddenly in the presence of curly tail lizards, shorter legged lizards were being favored. Natural selection was, the shorter legged lizards were surviving better. Whereas again, in the controls, there was no net selection at all. So what we had shown is that curly tail lizards exert strong selection and that the form of this selection changes through time. Now, we were, of course, very excited about this finding, and we were looking to see what would happen through time, because it's not going to go back and forth. Now that the brown anoles are up in the bushes, getting away from the curly tails, selection should favor short legs generation after generation. And so the question is, would they actually start evolving into twig anoles? Well, you may have guessed what happened next, but you're wrong. It was not a hurricane that hit. It was 2 hurricanes. First was Hurricane Francis, which went right over our study site. And then 3 weeks later, Hurricane Jean went out of its way, did a loop-de-loop to go over our study site, hitting the islands twice in a row and basically, sadly, ending that experiment. For the time being, the experiment has been restarted again after that, but that ended that chapter. With that, I want to briefly talk about an experiment looking at founder effects, although I'm not going to dwell on the founder effects themselves. Founder effects is the idea that populations formed by small number of individuals, founders, can, because of just the quirks of the genetics of those founders, can evolve in interesting and they could be important for major evolutionary advances. We wanted to test this on some of the islands that previously had been cleared away of lizards by just putting a male and a female on the island. And I'm not going to give many of the details, but I'd be happy to talk about it later. The important point that I want to make here is, as in the previous experiments, we took lizards from the larger island in the background that lived on big trees and had long legs and put them on this scrubby vegetation. So we did that for 7 islands founded by a male and a female, just to show you a few of our islands. These are small, scrubby islands. And the lizard populations thrived, even though they were founded by 2 individuals. You can see all the populations grew up to as many as 40 individuals. Well, the question then was did they evolve shorter legs as we would predict? Now, I want to tell you briefly some just fun stuff. Our equipment, our approach had varied. We now had a portable X-ray machine. No longer did we have to measure the lizards right in the field and let them go. We could bring them back to the field lab and take an X-ray. I should say, here's the source of the radiation up here. Here's the plate. It's sort of like the thing you put in your mouth at a dentist's office. And there's a little lizard. We've briefly anesthetized it. We're X-raying it. I love this machine because we get much more accurate measurements, and we have a record later that we can look at them again, as opposed to once you let the lizard go, it's gone. And we found all kinds of cool things. For example, look at these X-rays. If you look at this lizard here, you see these things? I'm going to give you a moment to try to figure out what they are. They're snails. It turns out these lizards eat lots of snails. We had no idea about that. Here we have a big female, and just to show you how big their eggs are, perhaps you can see the egg right here. You can see, so you can see the eggs. They only lay 1 egg at a time, and you can see why. They're enormous. finally, here we found several instances of this. This is a big male. It has a snail, but can you see what this is? You probably can. This is a baby lizard. We documented that cannibalism occurred. It was known to occur, but we found several instances of it. So all kinds of cool stuff on the X-rays. Here's just one more example from some islands from another study. A whole bunch of lizards had their forearms chopped off. We don't know. We're thinking maybe there's particularly many crabs on the island or seabirds. We don't know, but just this one set of islands at 1 year, we found a lot of this. So the X-rays are lots of fun, but it let us measure their limb length. Other things that we're doing that I'm not going to talk about. Here's Jason Colby measuring toe pad size on a scanner, allowing us to much more accurate measurements, and so on. So the prediction: their legs will get shorter. Sure enough, all 7 populations evolved shorter legs over the course of 3 years. So again, emphasizing that they do seem to be evolving as a response to the vegetation they're on. So, so that is sort of the research, the major questions we've had. As I've said, we're waiting. We've had several more hurricanes hit these islands, but we're still trying to get this experiment on the effect of predation to see, the longer term consequences. Oh, here's this experiment again showing on these founder islands. Here is the range in limb length. I'm sorry, here's the range in limb length compared to what our plasticity study has shown. And yes, well, what happened to these islands? They got hit by 2 hurricanes in succeeding years that wiped out all 7 islands. These are very low-lying islands, so it's not surprising. All right, so I'd like to finish the talk with 2 sort of more recent studies. And these studies have one thing in common, and that is that they were conceived of, and really the brainchild and hard work of postdocs in the lab. And in both cases, my role in the experiment to some extent was to tell the postdocs that it would never work. These were bad ideas, not a good use of their time, and suggested against it. And it turns out that I have been fortunate to have postdocs who are either brilliant or stubborn or actually both, and they insisted on doing the projects, and they were both right. The first project was done by Uriel La Piedra, who was interested very much in the evolution of behavior. And he wanted to ask, in these predation experiments, is there actually any selection on the behavior of the lizards as well as the morphology? And this came out of all the recent interest in, personalities, the idea that lizards many different animals have different behavioral tendencies. And so his idea was this: imagine a lizard sitting on a tree. And those lizards may vary in their propensity to run down to the ground to capture prey or to confront other lizards, to court females and so on, if it's a male. And one could imagine that that on the one hand, in the absence of predators, those lizards might catch more food. The ones that are bolder, if I can use that word very anthropomorphically, such behavior would be beneficial. They would eat more, maybe they'd be more successful in courtship and so on. Conversely, in the presence of predators, such behavior might be detrimental. They might be more likely to get eaten, and a more cautious lizard, if you will, that behavioral phenotype would be favored. So that was the idea that Uriel wanted to test. And so here's just the idea. You can imagine there's variation in what we'll call propensity to forage. In the absence of predators, the ones who are more likely to run the ground will be favored, and the behavior will evolve to be more of that. So those sorts of lizards in the population. Conversely, with the predators, the opposite would occur. So Uriel set up an experiment in the same area around Abaco. And what he did was he collected a whole bunch of lizards and developed behavioral trials to measure their behavioral tendencies. And let me show you what those behavioral trials look like. He would catch a lizard, put it in a box just in the dark for a while to calm down. Then he would put a curly-tailed lizard in a container so the curly-tail couldn't get to the anole, and he would open the door. So the anole looks out, sees a curly-tailed lizard. Oh my God, there's a big predator there. Then he would take the predator away, and he would simply measure how long before the lizard would come out of the box and sit on the ground before going up the little tree that was provided. So it was a measure of their propensity to forage on the ground in the presence, knowing that there are predators about. So he would measure this for each lizard, and he did it several times to establish that it was a pretty repeatable, consistent trait among, there's repeatable inter-individual difference among lizards. All right, so he measured the behavior of all these lizards. He gave them the same sort of tags I've shown you about, and then he introduced them to one of 8 islands. And these islands, so on one of 8 islands, the lizards were allowed to sit there for a month, And then 4 of the islands randomly were chosen to receive curly-tailed lizards, shown in green. So what happened? And then he came back 4 months later to see who had evolved. Well, we found the same ecological results, that survival was higher in the absence of predators, just as we'd seen several times before. And in the presence of the predators, they perched higher in the tree. So the curly tails were having the same effect as in previous experiments. Was there any selection on behavior? We'll look at time exposed on the ground, how much they're willing to sit on the ground where predators could be. On the islands without curly tails, there was no selection on behavior. You can see that this is the different lizards, the value measured in the lab, and the ones that sat on the ground a little time had no difference from those that were willing to sit on the ground out in the open for a long time. No selection. However, in the presence of predators, a very different story. Those lizards that have the behavior where they sit out in the open a lot survive at a much lower rate. And so what Uriel had shown is that, in fact, this repeatable behavior can be selected upon by curly tails, that those that in this case, lizards who are bold, if you will, get hammered by the predators. And so one could well imagine that this would lead to evolutionary change. And over time, we would have different behavioral phenotypes on these different islands. And Uriel has also looked at the heritability of this. And actually, I don't think that's been published yet. Well, you guessed what happened. Hurricane Dorian, a particularly bad hurricane, hit those islands a few years ago and wiped out the lizard populations. They didn't completely the curly tails got wiped out, but the brown anoles were able to hang on, and those islands are recovering, and Uriel is reviving that experiment. But that's as far as that goes. I now want to go to the second project. This one was spearheaded by another great postdoc in the lab, Colin Donahue, also with Anthony Harel from the Natural History Museum and CNRS in Paris. These are the people who really took charge of this experiment. This had a slightly different focus, and this is actually conducted down in the Turks and Caicos to the southeast of the Bahamas, and we're switching species finally, not Anolis. So here, and particularly on these small islands in the Turks and Caicos, Water Key and Pine Key. And the species in this case is Anolis scriptus. This is a species highly convergent on the brown anole in habitat use, behavior, and morphology, but a different species, but very similar. And the genesis of this experiment is that, like many places around the world, these islands are overrun by invasive species, cats and rats and goats. The vegetation was severely impacted. The predatory cats and rats impacted lots of the organisms. However, the wonderful organization, Fauna and Flora International, was about to remove the invasive species to let the islands recover, to return to their hopefully natural state. And Colin had the great idea of seeing how would the lizard population respond to both the increased vegetation and the reduction in predation. And so working with Fauna and Flora International, he arranged this project. So the first step was to go down and get the baseline data before the removal occurred. And so he went down, he and Anthony and others, and they collected the same sort of data that we always collect on these lizards, their morphology, their habitat use, and so on of this species. And they left on September 4th, 2017. And I highlight that date because 4 days later, Hurricane Irma went directly over the islands. And 2 weeks later, Hurricane Maria did the same thing. And so typical hurricane impacts study like the other ones we've had, although these are larger islands than the ones we worked on in the Bahamas. Well, Colin had measured the populations immediately before the hurricane. So the question was, were these hurricanes in any way a selective agent? Now, I do want to point, so he went back as soon as he could, 6 weeks later, got back down there to recensus the populations. I do want to point out that the lizards had not been marked in advance because we didn't know these hurricanes were coming. It wasn't the idea. So we're comparing the population means before and after the hurricane. And focusing on the toe pads, a trait that I have not talked about so far, he compared the toe pads, and what he found was, let's look here on the forelimb, on both islands, the mean toe pad size was larger after the hurricane for both populations, and then the same result for the toe pads on the hind limbs. Now, there are a number of possible explanations from this, but the most likely explanation is that the lizards with small toe pads simply couldn't hang on as well and got blown away by the hurricane. And that seems like the most likely explanation, that actually and this would indicate that natural selection was actually favoring larger toe pads as a result of hurricanes. A very exciting finding. Now, stepping back a moment, for years I had talked about toe pad variation in anoles, and one of the things I had pointed out, based on a paper from from 2003, is that lizards in mainland Central and South America have smaller toe pads than lizards on the islands. And I just pointed that out as an interesting geographical difference. People would ask, well, could that be because of hurricanes? Because for the most part, hurricanes don't hit mainland Central and South America. And I thought that was really unlikely because hurricanes don't come to the Caribbean that frequently. And presumably selection from year to year between hurricanes would erase any hurricane impact, even if there was one. So I poo-pooed the idea. Well, after finding these results, Colin wanted to explore this idea. I discouraged him. I'd say, you're not going to find anything, you're going to waste your time. He insisted on doing it. So what he did was he identified 12 islands in the Caribbean that the brown anole occurs on, and teaming up with a meteorologist at Penn State, they were able to measure the hurricane activity over the last 70 years on those 12 islands. And basically the brighter and the redder and the bigger the dot, the more hurricanes have hit that particular island. And so he had an index of hurricane activity on these islands, and he measured the toe pads on lizards of these islands. And to my surprise, what he found was that on islands where hurricane activity is greater, they have larger toe pads. And he did all kinds of analyses with other potentially confounding variables. Nothing else would explain toe pad size. Okay, then he repeated the analysis for all Anola species throughout their range and also throughout the Greater Antilles, just in the islands. And again, the same result. Now, there's a lot of variation because species vary due to their ecology. Arboreal species have bigger toe pads than terrestrial ones. But still, there was a correlation between toe pad size and hurricane activity. To my mind, this is pretty convincing evidence that hurricanes actually are serving as a selective factor favoring larger toe pads, and that this selection is strong enough, or the impact strong enough, that this effect persists even though hurricanes hit any given island not that frequently. I think the combination of data would seem to support this. Of course, it would be great if we could actually do a selection study with marked individuals before and after a hurricane, but you never know where hurricanes are going to hit. Well, in any case, I never thought that I would be an expert on hurricanes. I haven't even told you about the ecosystem side of these studies led by Shaner and Spiller. But that's just part of the quirks I was talking about, of just the research has evolved through a career. So I'm sick of hurricanes, however. They keep on messing up. They're interesting, but enough already. Would really like to see what this predation experiment, let it run long enough to see the impact of predation. So what I'm hoping for is no more hurricanes. Let the people of the Bahamas and the lizards in the Bahamas just live in peace and see how evolution proceeds. Now, normally that's the end of my talk, but I am going to shamelessly do a little bit of self-promotion and tell you about what another thing I've been working on the last couple of years, completely unrelated to lizard evolution. And this project has come to fruition, so I apologize, but I want to tell you about my book on the science of domestic cats, and particularly what they tell us about how cats have evolved to be the wonderful organisms that they are today. And I've been working on this for years, and it's finally coming out in May. It's coming out both in the UK and in the US. As you can see, it's got different covers, different titles, but the text is identical. They didn't even change the spelling to make it correct for you Brits. So I hope you can understand that COLOR is color. Anyway, I couldn't help but just putting in a plug for these books. They come out in May. With that, thank you very much for your attention, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
And I will definitely be checking out that book. So we do have some questions. Hopefully I'll have time to sneak mine in as well. But let me see what come in from the audience. Okay, so there's a couple of questions here about, okay, so one is it possible to prove long using cross-sectional or longitudinal studies?
Is it possible? I didn't quite catch the question. Could you repeat it, please?
I understand it actually. Maybe the person who asked it can clarify. it says, is it possible to prove the longer length legs using cross-sectional studies? So I assume that means, can you estimate leg length accurately with just a cross-sectional study or a cross-sectional measure of the limb bones? Not sure, actually. I'm going to ask the person who posted that, that's Mona Geo, to clarify what they mean there. Here's another one by the same person, which is, if limb length were to be applied to mammals, would you expect the same results in terms of predation impact and limb length and behavior? So, for example, could predation pressure or lack of predation be related to kind of human evolution and movement from an arboreal to a more terrestrial?
Well, I think that there are, in theory, these ideas could apply, but every species biology and environmental context is different, and that would certainly play a major role in things. One of the questions what pops to my mind when you ask that question is, there used to be a cheetah in the North America, which went extinct relatively recently, and people have explained the reason we have a species here, it's called the pronghorn antelope. It's not closely related to antelopes in Africa, that is remarkably fast, and so much too fast to deal with the predators that are present today. And so the story has been that the speed of the pronghorn antelope is a result of predation by the American cheetah that is no longer present. One might hypothesize that in the absence of that predation, selection for being fast should be decreasing, and perhaps that would lead to shortening of the limbs or other traits in the pronghorns. No one has ever actually tested this idea that I'm aware of, but I would think that limb length does affect speed in many organisms. It's complicated by how they move and what they're doing and so on, but certainly there ought to be parallel cases. And as we have changed the environment and the predation pressure, one might expect this to be manifest in some ways. Other than studies, people have studied anoles in urban settings where things are different, and have shown that leg length does differ between urban and rural settings. Off the top of my head, I can't think of anyone who has studied this in other organisms, but plausibly, you wouldn't want to just randomly pick some organism and do that. But based on the biology, if you had reason to believe that limb length was related to speed and that in turn related to predation, it would certainly be worth looking at.
Use of limb length in prey-predator relationships in mammals through the Cenozoic. So Christine Janis,
of course,
has done a lot, and one of my favorite titles of a paper she wrote is called "Do Legs Support the Arms Race?" Which is a fantastic paper on that topic. So I highly recommend it to any of you.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I should have thought of that.
Let's see. Here's another one. Well, this is a good one. This is a wonderful series of experiments and observations, but could you have done them somewhere where your experiments are not destroyed by hurricanes every few years?
Well, there's several answers to that, and we've tried. Part of it is that so number one, you need islands of the right size, because the great thing about these islands is that they're very manageable. That bigger islands just become too hard to census the populations, and in many places, as islands get bigger, they also become much denser in vegetation, which practically makes it very harder to do this sort of work. So that's one issue. The other issue is getting permission to do the work, because this work doesn't sound good. It sounds like you're bringing in an invasive species that doesn't belong, which I would never advocate for. But what we were doing in this case was we were bringing in lizards that literally occur 100 yards away, and which we've documented, 100 meters for you guys. We've documented the lizards colonizing naturally. I didn't talk about that, but we have documented that. We've also documented hurricanes removing lizards from islands. So we were emulating a process that goes on all the time. And so I really don't think it's an ethical issue. Nonetheless, getting permission to do this in most places is very difficult. And the Bahamas have been very supportive of us. in part because as we were learning the effects of hurricanes on the ecosystems, they actually saw value in the work. So they've been very supportive. Other places, it's more difficult. We have done some of these projects in places in Florida, and it turns out they get hit by hurricanes too. One of my graduate students sadly found out. But it would be great to if it were possible, to do similar work elsewhere.
Okay, here's a question about how have all these hurricane events affected the genetic diversity of anoles. And they said that they remember your paper with Colby suggesting showing strong phylogeographic signal in their native range. So wondering if there's been evidence of hurricanes causing bottlenecks and whether it slows and how that relates to kind of the speeding up and slowing down of the evolution of the phenotype.
Let me think about this for a moment. In the natural range, I don't think anyone has looked at that question. The work he refers to is work not quite at the scale that one could look at the effect of hurricanes on genetic diversity. So I think the answer is no. It would be really interesting to look at that. There is certainly very strong structure in the genetic variation across this species, which occurs throughout much of the northern Caribbean. I do want to just segue to a slightly tangential point, and that is in that founder effect study that I mentioned, where we put lizards on islands with a male and a female, and the female actually was gravid and inseminated when she was put there, so it was slightly more than 2 individuals. But after a few years, we did compare the FST between these experimental islands, and the values that we got, if you didn't know anything and just had naively done a study, you would have said these had been differentiating for thousands, if not millions of years. They were so different, but it was just the result of a founding of a small population. And so it certainly showed how there is potential for both the colonization process of anoles and then for bottlenecks to really affect the patterns you see, at least on small islands.
Okay,
but no, that broader question would be very interesting to look at.
Here's a question. Is there any difference in sexual dimorphism observed during the selection experiment? So does predation pressure affect factors like dewlap morphology or courtship behaviors?
Well, dewlap morphology is an interesting one in particular, because that was something that we were very interested in looking at, actually, particularly in the on the founder islands, because we thought, well, so it is established that anoles use the color and pattern of their dewlaps as a way of recognizing their own species. There's pretty good evidence for that. And so the thought was that a combination of founder effects leading to random changes in the dewlap, plus perhaps adaptation to different islands where some islands are more open and sunnier, and that might favor darker, more contrasting dewlaps, that you might get populations on these different islands diverging in dewlap color, which perhaps would be along the way to establishing reproductive isolation. We found no evidence of that. It was a great idea, well, a fun idea to test, but no evidence for that. More generally, similarly, we haven't found any evidence of courtship behavior changing. One thing that we did find, this was Manuel Leal work, was that on islands with predators, they do change how much they bob their head up and down, which presumably they were doing to not be as conspicuous to the predators. And that could have some impact in theory, but that's as far as we've gone with it. So it's a fascinating topic. Well, it's a fascinating topic.
Let's see, there's tons of questions coming in now. I'm going to try and get through them. Let's see, you see amazingly strong and rapid responses to selection often from small finding groups. This must mean a lot of genetic variation is available in many traits. Where does it all come from? Are population sizes on the source islands really big? Yes, so
these lizards can be extraordinarily dense where you find them. And so they have very large population sizes. And yes, they do have a lot of genetic variation in the bigger islands where they occur. Shaner years ago documented in some islands a density of 1 lizard per square meter, which is amongst the highest population densities of lizards ever recorded. So they can be extremely dense.
This question is a good follow-on to that, which is, have you ever observed any hybrids due to introduction on different islands, or are these lizards, are they all highly reproductively isolated to different species?
We have not found any hybrids. So the particular species in question would be the green anole and the brown anole. And people do occasionally take photographs of the two species mating in various places because they're found in Florida and elsewhere. There's no evidence that that has led to the production of offspring. And in fact, the phylogeny tells us that these two species are diverged by many millions of years. And so it would actually be surprising if they were able to produce hybrids. And there's no evidence of that.
Let's see. Okay, this one is from Ashwini. Assuming there is an erosion of genetic diversity in smaller island populations due to hurricanes, has there been a link established between low genetic diversity and strength of selection, for example, the mainland versus the island populations? A lot of questions about genetic diversity. I feel like you kind of said you don't know those.
Yes, I don't think anyone has looked into that. And so I don't have an answer for that. I do want to say one thing, though, and that is there's a massive comparative phylogenomics project going on anoles right now. It's being led by Anthony Geneva at Rutgers University, where we've got 12 reference genomes at very high resolution and doing a lower coverage, but still pretty good coverage of every anola species almost that exists. Got a big group of collaborators, and I think the opportunity to do a lot more cool genomic work on anoles is really going to take off very soon. This is a project long in the coming, and it's finally reaching fruition. So these are great questions, and hopefully we can soon begin to get to the answer to the bottom of them, as well as starting to try to identify the genes responsible for some of these traits.
There was some presentations about that project at SICB just last week, where Ashwini and I were both there. Sorry, my dog has just come in. He's wondering about these cat pictures on my screen. In that study, how long did you wait to see the change in leg length? Like, is the change reversible if you alter the environment, and are you able to see similar changes in adults? Or is there a critical period for developing the different phenotypes?
So those are great questions, and we don't have the answers. Our general approach has been to go to the islands once a year and to survey them. At the beginning of some of the experiments, we did it multiple times a year, but the logistics of working in the Bahamas prevents more fine scale getting data on that. So we don't have the answer to that. It would be really interesting to look at.
How would head bobbing affect predators?
Well, in two ways. Here, I'll put a lizard up now for a while. There are two ways it might affect them. On the one hand, it might draw the attention of the predators, that you see this thing bobbing, say, oh, there's a lizard over there. I'll go and see if I can catch it and eat it. On the other hand, a curious observation that anyone who's worked on anoles in nature has observed is that anoles will, if you walk up to a tree like these ones on the screen, the anoles will often start dewlapping at you. And why are they doing that? It had always struck me as just some mistake in their hardwiring that led them to dewlap instead of stay quiet or run away. Years ago, though, Manuel Leal did a study in Puerto Rico with a similar species, Anolis cristatellus, where he showed that lizards with greater endurance capacity would actually display more to a predatory snake. And so he argued that it was an honest signal of escape ability, and they were telling the lizards, the predators, don't waste your time chasing me because I've got a lot of endurance. I'll run away. If you catch me, I'll bite you really hard and won't let go, which Manuel demonstrated. And so that they might actually be signaling to the predator by displaying that way. So it could work in both ways.
There's a question about the individuals with the missing forelimbs. Are they able to regrow them?
No, that's a good question. Salamanders, which are amphibians, can regrow legs and so on, but lizards cannot do that. And so no, they cannot regrow them. They can regrow their tails, but only their tails.
Or what happened to their limbs?
Oh, after they get amputated?
You said just that one year, one island, a whole bunch of them were missing their forelimbs.
Yes, and so I have to say that was on an island that we hadn't been monitoring regularly. So I don't know if it was always that way. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, it's not like all the lizards, but it was a couple of percent of them, whereas normally we found this very rarely. I really don't know.
Okay, well, here's another one. In a phylogenetic overview of the Caribbean anoles, is there any pattern relating species differentiation to geographic isolation, or do sister species occur in close proximity? So I think this goes back to kind of the beginning of your talk a little bit.
Yeah, so the basic story is this, that on each of the islands of the Greater Antilles in the Caribbean, which is Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica, anoles have, for the most part, evolved independently. There have been different radiations on each island. Those radiations are actually quite old, arguably in the range of 30 million years. So they're very old radiations, and they have produced different numbers of species that is related to island size. Jamaica is the smallest island, and there are 6 native species there, whereas Cuba has, I think at last count, 64 or so. So there's been this great diversification, and for the most part, species on each island are more closely related to each other than they are to species on other islands. Within an island, something that we haven't talked about too much, but there are actually and then on each island, the species diversify to use different parts of the environment and to adapt morphologically and behaviorally. And we call those different habitat specialist types, the jargon is we call them ecomorphs. So for example, the brown anole on the screen here is a trunk ground ecomorph. It lives on tree trunks, uses the ground a lot, has long hind legs and a variety of other characteristics. As I mentioned, very similar species have evolved completely independently on all 3 of the other islands. And if I showed you all of them, you might say, well, it's the same thing, but they're not, they're independently evolved. So on different islands, they are not at all, the similar species are not closely related. Another aspect of their radiation, which has been talked about less, is that within an island, an ecomorph will diversify into many different species. And so, for example, in Cuba, there are 14 species of trunk ground anoles, all related to each other. And the reason there are 14 is that there is some geographic variation. Some species are only found on particular mountains or other regions. And then within a habitat, sometimes species have adapted to use different climates. So the brown anole likes it out in the sun where it's warm. There's a very similar species that is found in the forest in shade where it's cooler, and even another one found in deep forest where it's even cooler yet. And yet they're in the same place. You can find all 3 of them within 5 minutes, but they've divided the thermal niche, if you will. And so you get these very similar species within an island. The fact that they're trunk ground anoles is ancestral for them. They haven't independently evolved it, but they've produced different species geographically or along a different ecological axis. So that makes answering that question convoluted, and I'm not sure I even actually answered the question, but that's kind of the dimensions of at least phenotypic variation.
The person who asked about head bobbing wants to know what is dewlapping, which I assume was just the.
All right, here I used to show a video of this, but I can't get it quickly. So dewlapping is this: the lizard's sitting on a tree, just like you see there. They will push up with their forelegs, or sometimes with their hind legs too. So up and down, and then they'll stick their dewlap out, as these 2 lizards are, and they'll stick it out. They'll bring it back in. Sometimes they'll without doing the push-ups, they'll just go in and out. Sometimes they'll do the push-ups without bring the dewlap in and out. So that's kind of how they display. And as I said, they display oddly to predators. Most of the time they're displaying to other males or to court females. So it's used in multiple contexts. I should point out that particularly in the Caribbean, most females have a very small dewlap or don't have one at all. Interestingly, in Central and South America, there are quite a few species where the female has a large dewlap herself. And so how we account for that variation in the extent of sexual dimorphism is an open question.
Speaking of videos, I can't believe you didn't show the videos of the experiments in the showers showing if the ones with longer limbs can actually hold on better with the wind blower.
Yes, that's out there. That's Colin Donahue's work, and you can find it on YouTube. I'm not sure if you put hurricane lizard clinging on, you might. It's a fun video where he used basically a leaf blower to try to simulate a hurricane to see, what they do and what happens when they get. Sure enough, if you crank up the wind blower high enough, they lose hold on the surface and they get blown into a net that catches them without any harm.
No lizards were harmed in those studies.
Exactly.
Great. I think I've made it through. Oh, there's one more. Oh, no, there's a couple more. Question for me. So the person was do legs support the arms race? That's from Christine Janis, Janis. Great. So since I've gotten through all the questions, I get the pleasure of asking the last question then, which is thinking about projecting forward. Obviously, you were talking about kind of the lull in hurricanes, and the number of years it takes actually to repopulate some of these islands where they do have kind of natural dispersal. But of course, is rapidly increasing. So, is there a future for anoles on these small islands?
Well, I would say many of these small islands, as I said, they're 2 or 3 meters above sea level, and with the sea level going up and hurricanes becoming, there's some debate whether they're more frequent or more severe or both, but I think it's going to be tough on these small islands for lizards to be found on them. So yes, I think that it doesn't look great. On the other hand, they're on big islands, they'll be fine. But on the little islands, yeah, I think it's a matter of time before many of them just become uninhabitable.
That's interesting. If you think about what that might look like in the fossil record in the future, these weird little specimens that are maybe a little bit different in phenotype or your distribution of traits, and somebody trying to figure out what that actually reflects. Hopefully we'll have good modeling back then.
I think it's a fascinating metapopulation type phenomenon with different there's a source sink component, and there's different selection pressures on different islands due to their vulnerability to hurricanes, also due to different species of competitors and predators on these islands. And we have never gotten to that level, but it would be fascinating to be able to study that milieu of different contexts and the interaction among them.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was absolutely fantastic. I'm sorry, you might have noticed I'm drinking my wine, because normally we would be at our wine reception in the library, carrying on these discussions further. That was an absolutely fantastic talk, an amazing system, and I think clearly, lots of accolades are coming in on the Q&A for you for your great talk. Oh, there's one more question, if you don't mind, before I wrap up here, which is about the eggs surviving the hurricane. What were the specific conditions? You said they were ground eggs. Were they buried or?
So briefly, so these islands are limestone islands, so they're very craggly, if you will, with lots of little holes and so on. The lizards go into those holes, and presumably, we don't have a lot of good data on, presumably that's where they're laying their eggs. They go into the holes, into the decaying leaf litter, and lay the eggs there. So what happened was that the first hurricane I told you about, lizards were gone. But the second hurricane, we went back a month later, and the island was covered with baby lizards. There were no adults or anything more than a baby. So they had to have come from eggs. And that hurricane was just a month earlier. And just they stopped breeding around end of September, October, and it must have just bracketed when all the eggs have hatched out already. So we subsequently did an experiment where we subjected lizard eggs to put them in salt water for 6 hours. And to our amazement, eggs in the first half of the incubation cycle, about 10 days or so, were completely unaffected by being in salt water for 6 hours. And so, if you think about it, actually osmotically, the inside of an egg is pretty salty, and they don't need much oxygen because they're not very big at that stage. But so young eggs survive just fine. And so that's, so it was being underwater didn't affect them, which was not what I would have expected naively.
maybe a little bit of hope in terms of being able to withstand more of these events. Well, great. Well, thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.